I have sound now. Son of a bitch. I was so caught up in it, I wasn't paying attention to my sound. Thank you for letting me know that. At least I'm not 40 minutes in when I find out. I'll have to do a little editing at the beginning of this video because now I have to start over on the reading. Thank you for that. Oh, that pisses me off. I hate it when I do that. Okay, so what I started out this session saying is this is the second half of the seventh chapter because it was such a long chapter I had to cut it in half. Okay, so let's try that for take two. Man, makes me mad. All right. Above all, the years immediately following the revolution brought a mood of self-congratulation. For the first time, numerous writers began to review the history not only of slavery but of anti-slavery sentiment. To their astonishment, they found that except for a few isolated voices, Negro slavery had been virtually unopposed prior to the imperial crisis. Such research gave a new self-consciousness to anti-slavery leaders. It also led to two conclusions that would have contradictory consequences. First, it appeared that the exertions of a few dedicated individuals could transform the public consciousness. Second, since so much had been accomplished in so brief a time, it seemed that post-revolutionary Americans could marvel less at their own remnants of inconsistency than at the incredible progress of anti-slavery sentiment. These memes provided a formula for evasion, or for what the American Convention in 1794 termed, quote, our consolation and encouragement, end quote. Recent history showed that one could count on, quote, the irresistible though silent progress of the principles of true philosophy, end quote, followed by yet another quote, and everybody knows this pisses me off when they do so many quotes in a row, because it's hard to read out loud. Quote, let us remember, the convention urged its constituent abolition societies, although interest and prejudice may oppose, yet the fundamental principles of our government, as well as the progressive and rapid influence of reason and religion, are in our favor, end quote. The more that reformers praised American institutions and congratulated themselves on living in an enlightened age, the more prepared they were to postpone the revolution's goal to future centuries. Thus, William Griffith, addressing the New Jersey Abolition Society in 1804, expressed, quote unquote, wonder and gratification over the immense progress America had made in eradicating slavery and assimilating Negroes to the standards of their superiors. Much was still to be done, especially before, quote, riches increase and corruption, as it will, gains on the public morals, end quote. It was imperative to act while, quote, individual and national feelings are alive to sentiments of charity and justice, end quote. Yet Griffith cautioned, another quote, nor is it to be wished, much less expected, that sudden and general emancipation should take place. A century may and probably will elapse, though every fair exertion shall be made before it can be eradicated from our country. End quote. In 1793, Noah Webster was not quite so optimistic, although he had no rival in celebrating the glories and promise of American life. His predictions about slavery must be comprehended in juxtaposition with his introductory paean to the new republic. Quote, here the equalizing genius of the laws distributes property to every citizen. Here no tithes, no rack rents, no lordly exactions of gratuities and fines for alienation, no arbitrary impositions of taxes harass the cultivator of the soil and repress his exertions. Here no beggarly monks and friars, no princely ecclesiastics with their annual incomes of millions, no idle court pensioners and titled mendicants, no spies to watch and betray the unsuspecting citizen, no tyrant with his train of hounds, bastards, and mistresses. Here no commercial or corporation monopolies give exclusive advantages to favored individuals. No sacramental test bars the conscientious sectary from places of trust and emolument. Here no monasteries, convents, and nunneries, the retreats of idleness and the nurseries of superstition and debauchery. Here every man finds employment, and the road is open for the poorest citizen to amass wealth by labor and economy, and by his talents and virtue to raise himself to the highest offices of state. End quote. And so on to the vista of wealth, manufacturing, and commerce. And in the short period of 100, oh, sorry, quote, and in the short period of 170 years since our ancestors landed on these shores, a trackless wilderness inhabited only by savages and wild beasts is converted into fruitful fields and meadows more highly cultivated than one half of Europe. End quote. During his travels, Webster had seen how the fields were cultivated in South Carolina, and he reminded his readers that the proportion of slaves in the American population was, quote, a circumstance which cannot fail to allay the joy that the prosperous state of the country would otherwise inspire in every patriotic bosom, end quote. In Webster's view, this circumstance was an unfortunate accident, the product of the misguided policy of an unenlightened age. Oddly enough, however, his model for emancipation had nothing to do with the brave new world where, quote, the mind of man, as free as the air he breathes, may exert all its energy, and by expanding its powers to distant and various objects, its faculties may be enlarged to a degree hitherto unknown, end quote. Rather, when Webster thought of emancipation, his mind turned to the gradual elevation of serfs which had presumably taken place in the depraved environment that Americans had escaped. Quote, indeed, if we judge from the fate of villanage in many parts of Europe, it is no ill-founded prediction that slavery in this country will be utterly extirpated in the course of 2 centuries, perhaps in a much shorter period, without any extraordinary efforts to abolish it. End quote. Excuse me. Webster recognized that such progress would be too slow to satisfy, quote, the friends of humanity in their enlightened period of the world, end quote. And he called for efforts both public and private, quote, to accelerate the progress of freedom with all convenient speed, end quote. Nevertheless, the whole point of his argument was the peril of any sudden abolition. Negro emancipation would come inevitably without extraordinary effort, although the task might take as long as had America's slow emancipation from Europe. Webster was not alone in seeing the post-revolutionary years as a midpoint between the origins of North American slavery and colonization and a terminal date of about 1960. Nor was he alone in screening out any perceptions that might cast doubt on his belief in irresistible progress. Like various other anti-slavery writers of the time, Webster found himself in the anomalous position of exclaiming over the quote-unquote improved condition of Southern slaves. Masters had been touched by the benevolent spirit of the age and had also come to appreciate that kindness was good policy. American slaves already enjoyed many of the privileges of English villains and or villains, and could never again be forced, for example, to dig more than a quarter of an acre of land in a day, or to work on the days they called their own. Indicating a similar frame of mind, the American Convention urged in 1798 that slaves should be quietly submissive to their masters, since this would lead to better treatment and might also help persuade masters of the injustice of human bondage. But however sanguine Americans might be about the distant future, they could not escape the idea of declension, since virtually any statute on slavery was bound to compromise the quote unquote higher law principle of natural rights. It was clear that Union required the postponement of emancipation not only in the South but in most of the northern states as well. Yet the revolution had been rooted in the quote unquote higher law doctrine as quoted by Benezet that quote no legislature on earth can alter the nature of things or that to be make that to be lawful which is contrary to the law of God end quote. The success of the revolution presumably showed the danger as well as the illegitimacy of laws based on expediency, of laws like those of Parliament, which had sanctioned the Guinea trade, and which, as Benezet put it, had brought, quote, under hard bondage a people over whom the Parliament had not the least shadow of rights, end quote. In 1783, Benezet exhorted British Quakers to begin pressing the king and Parliament to abolish the iniquitous traffic. At the same time, however, he wrote to Benjamin Franklin, then in Paris, observing that it was, quote, sorrowfully astonishing that after the declaration so strongly and clearly made of the value and right of liberty in this continent, no state but that of Pennsylvania, and that imperfectly, have yet taken a step towards the total abolition of slavery. End quote. Hugh Henry Brackenridge mockingly praised Pennsylvania's act on the grounds of expediency, which he said should be extended still further. Quote, on this principle, I have always thought a defect in the criminal codes of most nations not giving license to the perpetrators of offenses to proceed for a limited time in larcenies, burglaries, etc., until they get their hands out of use to these pursuits and in use to others, for it must be greatly inconvenient to thieves and cutthroats who have engaged in this way of life and run great risks in acquiring skill in their employment to be obliged all at once to withdraw their hands and lay aside picking locks and applying themselves to industry in other ways for a livelihood. End quote. That was pretty sarcastic. Legislators, he warned, should never confuse the slavery issue with moral doubts regarding the original right of capturing or subjugating Africans, since that would raise difficulties over the, quote, natural right to hold a slave for a moment, even whether the law sanctioned it or not, in which case we should find it necessary to go as far as the fanatics in religion and set our slaves free altogether, end quote. This was the quote unquote higher law doctrine advanced by George Wallace, by the French encyclopedists, and by a scattering of American Quakers and Calvinists. In America, the state constitutions supposedly embodied the higher law of natural rights. Yet David Cooper expressed dismay over the constitutions which showed such extraordinary care in guarding the rights and privileges of white citizens, but which gave, quote, no gleam of notice, end quote, to the oppressed Africans. The Vermont Constitution of 1777 specifically outlawed slavery. Several Massachusetts towns objected to the lack of such a clause in the Massachusetts Constitution of 1778. But the framers of the new 1780 Constitution contented themselves with a general declaration that, quote, all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, end quote. Jeremy Belknap later wrote that this Bill of Rights, which roughly followed the wording of the Virginia Convention of 1776, had been inserted, quote, with a particular view to establishing the liberty of the Negroes on a general principle, and so it was understood by the people at large. But some doubted whether this was sufficient, end quote. Moses Brown, for one, was convinced by 1784 that the Massachusetts Constitution had put an end to slavery and that Negroes had been adjudged to be free. Various historians have tried to penetrate the obscurity surrounding the now famous Walker cases, quote unquote. Quock, I guess is quack. Um, Sounds like a name. Um, the have tried to penetrate the obscure surrounding the now famous Quack Walker cases, but have reached little agreement on the actual process of emancipation in Massachusetts. Here it is sufficient to say that by the early 1780s, Massachusetts slaveholders had little confidence in their legal claims to proprietorship, in part because of the actions of town governments. That an attorney like Levi Lincoln was prepared to write an eloquent brief condemning slavery on religious and quote unquote higher law principles, but with little reference to the Constitution, and that while individual slaves were freed by jury decisions, or by their boldness in simply leaving their masters, no court specifically and clearly ruled that slavery was unconstitutional, although Chief Justice William Cushing instructed a jury in 1783 that slavery was inconsistent with the Constitution. Regardless of popular opinion in Massachusetts, there was no publicized case that encouraged constitutional emancipation in other states with similar bills of rights. In 1794, for example, the Council of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society was evenly divided on whether the 1790 State Declaration of Rights had outlawed slavery. Though the Society pursued the question in court, the High Court of Errors and Appeals judged that slavery had existed legally in the state prior to the 1790 Constitution and was unaffected by the Declaration of Rights. Encouraged by signs of unmistakable progress, abolitionists also fell within the yawning gap between revolutionary expectations and political realities. In 1776, Samuel Hopkins could assure the honorable members of the Continental Congress that their resolution against the slave trade, quote, leaves in our minds no doubt of your being sensible of the equal unrighteousness and oppression as well as inconsistence with ourselves in holding so many hundreds of thousands of blacks in slavery who have equal right to freedom with ourselves. End quote. He could express confidence that they would apply their wisdom, quote, to bring about the total abolition of slavery, end quote. By 1787, he was reporting to Moses Brown that various Rhode Island clergymen objected to petitioning the state assembly on the subject of the slave trade since, quote, the present ruling part in the assembly have appeared to be so destitute of all principle of justice or regard to it that there is an impropriety in applying to them for justice, end quote. No doubt Hopkins was surprised when the Assembly in that very year voted to prohibit the slave trade. But in 1787, Hopkins was well aware of the debates in a larger political arena. Along with other anti-slavery leaders, he felt that the Constitutional Convention should be bound by the precedents of the Revolution, particularly the 1774 Slave Trade Resolution and the Declaration of Independence. There is fragmentary evidence of organized attempts on the part of abolitionists to influence the Philadelphia delegates. Since 1783, the Quakers especially had gained experience from their lobbying campaigns with state assemblies, with the Continental Congress, and via their British connections with Parliament. In petitioning the Constitutional Convention, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society appealed to the revolutionary resolutions against the slave trade, to Europe as a judge of hypocrisy, and to the certainty of divine judgment. Tench Coxe, that's Tench, Coxe, I guess, is Coxe, a member of the society and one of the earliest champions of the Constitution, later confided to James Madison that it had required tremendous efforts to suppress the pleas of overzealous but honest men. Quote, a very strong paper was drawn and put into my hands, he wrote, to procure the signature of Dr. Franklin to be presented to the Federal Convention. I enclosed to the doctor with my opinion that it would be a very improper season and place to hazard the application. End quote. At this time, Coxe was in correspondence with prominent British abolitionists who were eager for information on the achievements of emancipated Negroes. Coxe, an ardent Federalist and proponent of industrial progress, shared with the more progressive British reformers a common set of values. What separated them and what proved to be a liability to American anti slavery was the different meaning of rising establishments, quote unquote. In 1787, even in 1792, England could hardly match America in the number of prominent citizens who theoretically embraced the anti slavery cause. Statesmen of international rank, legislators, lawyers, clergymen, merchants, bankers, manufacturers, and prophets of the New Age. But the leading English spokesman for abolition was not faced with a constitutional convention, the success of which depended on the compliance of West Indian delegates. One may object that accommodation is the fulcrum of politics, that British anti-slavery leaders could bend when the occasion demanded, and that the weaknesses of anti-slavery principles cannot be gauged by what legislators did or left undone. In America, however, it was the revolutionary expectations that made the difference. Nor could Europe offer examples of virgin states, such as Kentucky, where colonizers were reenacting the drama of separation and self-determination. As David Rice exhorted the Danville Convention, which did not heed his words, quote, "Holding men in slavery is the national vice of Virginia, and while a part of that state, we were partakers of the guilt. As a separate state, we are just now come to the birth, and it depends upon our free choice whether we shall be born in this sin or innocent of it." End quote. The logic of the revolution suggested that such principles might have prevailed at the Constitutional Convention. For a time, it was by no means clear exactly which principles had prevailed. The text, like that of the text, like that of the King James Bible, scrupulously avoided the word slave. On November 8, 1787, an anonymous Pennsylvanian complained that, quote, "the words dark and ambiguous, such as no plain man of common sense would have used, are evidently chosen to conceal from Europe that in this enlightened century the practice of slavery has its advocates among men in the highest stations." End quote. Luther Martin, who was a disgruntled delegate, as a disgruntled delegate, had walked out of the convention and had refused to sign the Constitution, explained what lay behind the dark and ambiguous words. Leading a campaign in Maryland to oppose ratification, he exposed the deal within the committee of which he was a member, whereby the New England states had agreed to give the slave trade a 20-year immunity from federal restriction in exchange for Southern votes to eliminate any restrictions on navigation acts. To the rest of the world, Martin wrote, it was absurd. It must appear, quote, "absurd and disgraceful to the last degree that we should accept from the exercise of that power to regulate commerce, the only branch of commerce which is unjustifiable in its nature and contrary to the rights of mankind." End quote. Moreover, the authors had been so anxious to avoid a word, quote, "which might be odious in the ears of Americans," end quote, that they had inadvertently authorized Congress to impose a duty of $10 to any free immigrant who entered the United States. Martin, who had graduated from the Presbyterian College of New Jersey in the afterglow of the Great Awakening, expanded eloquently on the themes and inconsistency, apostasy, and divine judgment. The slave trade and three-fifths compromises, quote, "ought to be considered as a solemn mockery of and insult to that God whose protection we had then implored and could not fail to hold us up in detestation and render us contemptible to every true friend of liberty in the world. End quote. It ought to be considered, Martin warned, quote, that national crimes can only be and frequently are punished in this world by national punishments, and that the continuance of the slave trade and thus giving it a national sanction and encouragement ought to be considered as justly exposing us to the displeasure and vengeance of him who is equally Lord of all and who views with equal eye the poor African slave and his American master. End quote. At the convention, a number of delegates made such arguments, but were seldom free from the suspicion of ulterior motives. George George Mason, for example, who also refused to sign the Constitution, had much to say about the evils of slavery and the dangers of divine judgment. Like Martin, he was outraged by the coalition between the states of New England and the Deep South, a coalition which had shattered the expected alignment of agrarian interests. Yet, in opposing ratification in Virginia, Mason qualified his anti slavery principles by arguing that, quote, though this infamous traffic be continued, we have no security for the property of that kind which we have already. There is no clause in this Constitution to secure it, so that they have done what they ought not to have done, and have left undone what they ought to have done. End quote. And there was a quote within a quote there. During the convention debates, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney of South Carolina explained that Virginians could afford a specious humanitarianism. Quote, South Carolina and Georgia cannot do without slaves. As to Virginia, she will gain by stopping the importations. Her slaves will rise in value, and she has more than she wants. End quote. Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut pointed out that if slavery were to be considered in a moral light, quote, we ought to go farther and free those already in the country, end quote. This was a jibe at Mason. In justice to Georgia and South Carolina, Ellsworth argued the delegates should. Oh, wow, I just totally lost it. Sorry. In justice to Georgia and South Carolina, Ellsworth argued the delegates should remember that slaves, quote, multiply so fast in Virginia and Maryland that it is cheaper to raise than import them, whilst in the sickly rice swamps foreign supplies are necessary, end quote. He was confident in any event that poor laborers would soon become so plentiful, quote, as to render slaves useless. Slavery in time will not be a speck in our country. Provision is already made in Connecticut for abolishing it, end quote. Pinckney, on the other hand, held, quote, that the importation of slaves would be for the interest of the whole Union. The more slaves, the more produce to employ in carrying trade, and more consumption also, and the more of this, the more of revenue for the common treasury, end quote. It is not surprising that the Constitution was subject to a variety of interpretations, or that its defenders helped to popularize conflicting expectations. General William Heath assured the Massachusetts ratifying convention that, quote, the Federal Convention went as far as they could. The migration or importation, etc., is confined to the states now existing only. New states cannot claim it, end quote. Congress, he promised, had already prohibited slavery in the new states. William Dawes added, quote, that although slavery is not smited by an apoplexy, yet it has received a mortal wound and will die of a consumption, end quote. With these judgments, James Wilson entirely agreed. Speaking to the Pennsylvania Convention as one of the framers of the Constitution, he interpreted the slave trade clause, quote, as laying the foundation for banishing slavery out of this country, and though the period is more distant than I could wish, yet it will produce the same kind of gradual change which was pursued in Pennsylvania, end quote. Wilson also expressed confidence that Congress would never allow the introduction of slaves in the new states. In Virginia, however, Governor Edmund Randolph, also one of the framers, hinted at undisclosed understandings which convinced even South Carolina that slavery would be secure. Quote, I believe, whatever we may think here, that there was not a member of the Virginia delegation who had the smallest suspicion of the abolition of slavery, end quote. Farther to the south, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney had to meet objections that South Carolina had conceded too much. Unfortunately, he explained, quote, your delegates had to contend with the religious and political prejudices of the eastern and middle states, and with the interested and inconsistent opinion of Virginia, who was warmly opposed to our importing more slaves, end quote. Yet the Constitution in no way ruled that the slave trade must cease in 1808. It provided security that the general government could never emancipate slaves in the states. It guaranteed the right, quote, to recover our slaves in whatever part of America they may take refuge, which is a right we had not before, end quote. All things considered, Pinckney said, quote, we have made the best terms for the security of this species of property it was in our power to make. We would have made better if we could, but on the whole I do not think them bad, end quote. Robert Barnwell was even more sanguine. By 1808, he predicted the New England states would be the main carriers of slave cargoes, and it would thus be in their interest to encourage the trade as long as possible. Quote, I am of opinion, he concluded, that without we ourselves put a stop to them, the traffic in Negroes will continue forever, end quote. A few of the anti-slavery leaders appreciated that a fundamental law which satisfied so many interests could only be interpreted as the ultimate and fatal betrayal of the Revolution. In a letter to Moses Brown, William Roach anticipated the view of Garrison. The Constitution was, quote, founded on slavery, and that is on blood, end quote. But the sharpest public attacks on the Constitution came from men like Luther Martin and George Mason, who opposed ratification on a variety of grounds. And as Benjamin Rush informed Jeremy Belknap, the vast majority of Quakers were, quote unquote, highly federal. Quote, the appeals, therefore, that have been made to the humane and laudable prejudices of our Quakers by our anti-federal writers upon the subject of Negro slavery have been greeted by that prudent society with silence and contempt, end quote. By 1789, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society could assure the British abolitionists that no apostasy had occurred. The large number of Negroes in some states simply prevented, quote, making a general arrangement at this moment that should carry the American principles on this subject to their full length, end quote. Nevertheless, the Constitution should be considered as a testimonial against the slave trade, which would doubtless be abolished by the individual states in the near future. Then, in a classic use of projection, the Pennsylvanians added, quote, we are very sensible of the difficulties that must arise to you in Great Britain from the prejudices and arts of interested men, but similar prejudices have been removed and similar arts have been defeated in this country, end quote. Declension and justification. The American people, according to the First American Convention of Abolition Societies, could take pride in having originated the international movement against the slave trade. Yet by allowing slavery itself to continue, Americans were impeding the cause of political liberty in Europe. A slaveholding nation could not serve the world as a model of freedom. This argument had far reaching implications. If the entire world was on the eve of revolution, as Zephaniah Swift told the Connecticut Abolition Society in 1791, did this mean Americans would cheer for black slaves who fought for their own inalienable rights? In 1786, a correspondent wrote the New York Journal that recent murders in the West Indies indicated what punishment the buyers of human flesh could expect. Tyrannical countries everywhere would soon face the deluge, and, quote, the greatest philanthropist will not afford even a pitying sigh for those who have been or may be plundered, tormented, and even massacred by the avenging hands of their purchased slaves, end quote. 5 years later, the blacks of St. Domingue put the American ideology to its most critical test. If slaves could demonstrate their capacity for freedom by fighting for it, then how could white Americans sustain their double standard and still remain loyal to their revolutionary ideals? Abraham Bishop, a Connecticut radical and Yale classmate of Noah Webster, Joel Barlow, and Zephaniah Swift, put the issue in clear-cut terms. If, quote, if freedom depends upon color, and if the blacks were born for slaves, those in the West India Islands may be called insurgents and murderers, end quote. But surely Bishop hoped Americans were too open-minded to believe that color changes the natural rights of men. The cause of the blacks was as just as that of the white American patriots. The latter had drawn lost my place. The latter had drawn blood in order to rid themselves of illegitimate taxes. The West Indian slaves had been subjected to the most barbarous cruelty. Quote, then shall we preach lessons of coolness and moderation to the blacks? End quote. If the slaves had been treated with mildness, they might have used milder measures for achieving their natural rights. Until this moment, Bishop noted, Americans had seen the hand of Providence in every struggle against despotic rule. Quote, shall we now sacrifice principle to a paltry partiality for color? End quote. But as the Marquis de Condorcet had said in 1776, something in French, um, something about blacks and new ideas. I'm not quite sure. Some months after Abraham Bishop celebrated the cause of the blacks, the Amis de Noir had issued a public manifesto that echoed the quote-unquote higher law doctrine of George Wallace and the Encyclopédie, a really long French quote. Um, I could I can pick out a word here and there, something about men and nature. My French is not nearly good enough to attempt to get through that. Restitution, I see. Consequence. I can pick out single words, but acts of justice, declarations. Anyway, nothing could be clearer or more uncompromising. None of the early American anti-slavery societies issued a declaration that so directly challenged the lawfulness of human bondage. Yet the French reformers seemed far less sensitive to the question of quote-unquote inconsistency when it came to reconciling the interests, it's another French one, but the interests of humanity with the interests des propriétaires, of propriet. Anyway, And yet another long French quote. Something about the colonies and abandoning. I don't know. That's way beyond me. In France, as in America, this was the formula for dulling the edge of revolutionary doctrine. The evil of slavery justified its perpetuation, since avarice and oppression had rendered the blacks incapable of freedom. They were objects for compassion, candidates for uplift and reform. On a conceptual level, they had never lost their liberty or human rights. Existentially, they were defined as being incapable of free choice. In 1793, French refugees, many accompanied by their personal slaves, began streaming into American port cities. In 1804, the triumphant blacks proclaimed the Republic of Haiti. In the interim, which witnessed Gabriel Prosser's slave conspiracy in Virginia, Americans became terrified by what Winthrop Jordan had termed, quote, the cancer of revolution, end quote. As Jordan observes, there was more than a concern for security behind the shrill warnings, the laws excluding West Indian blacks, and the attempts to suppress all discussion of slavery. Quote, the ostentatiousness of all this caution is suggestive. Beyond a reasoned fear of domestic insurrection seems to have lain a desire to banish the reality of St. Domingo. End quote. For that reality demolished the myth that slaves were les enfants, so the children. I don't know. I don't know. It also exposed the hollowness of American pretensions. If Saint Domingue strengthened the clamor to end the slave trade, it also dealt a crushing blow to the abolition movement. The unwelcome spread of revolutionary violence in France as well as in the West Indies made it all the easier for abolitionists to rationalize the succession of grim events which undercut earlier expectations. The defeats began even before the fear of revolutionary contagion. In the first Congress, the explosive reaction of Southerners to moderate anti slavery petitions defined the terms of the federal quote unquote compact, intimidated future protest, and virtually precluded the British strategy of working through friends in the central government. This critical setback was followed by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 and by the clear indication that American lawmakers put the supposed property rights of slaveholders above the inalienable rights, quote unquote, of northern free Negroes who were being kidnapped and sold into the South in ever increasing numbers. The abolition societies then had to reconcile themselves to the admission of Kentucky and Tennessee as slave states, to North Carolina's re-enslavement of manumitted blacks, to Virginia's and Maryland's legal retaliation against abolitionists who sponsored suits. In 1797, Virginia reformers complained that a new law was, quote, calculated to destroy almost every suggestion of hope that any person can obtain liberty by due process of law, however valid their claim, or however indisputable their claim, or however indisputable their title, end quote. To the infiltration and subversion of the Alexandria, Virginia Abolition Society, to Congress's acceptance of slavery in Louisiana, to South Carolina's reopening of the slave trade, and finally to the shock of the Missouri crisis and the attempts to legalize slavery in Indiana and Illinois. During the first 2 decades of this declension, the abolition societies called for renewed dedication, warned against discouragement, emphasized the need for caution, and complained that their aims and methods had been badly represented. It was essential by 1804 to select officers who, quote, have their zeal tempered with prudence and knowledge, for we are sensible that for want of sound discretion on the part of some well-meaning but overzealous individuals, the views and conduct of the body at large have been grossly misunderstood. The cause has suffered undeserved reproach in the minds of some of our fellow citizens. End quote. In 1808, the Pennsylvania Society concluded that it would be too risky to authorize formal agencies in the southern states, as their acting committee had recommended. More attention should be given to the, quote, moral and intellectual improvement, end quote, of the blacks in Philadelphia, since the abolitionists' very success had encouraged an influx of black paupers and criminals who had damaged the cause. The Philadelphians noted that both public sentiment and the attitude of the courts were much less liberal than they used to be. The Ninth American Convention urged the New York Society to impress free blacks with the thought that future emancipations might well depend on their own good conduct. In 1809, the Wilmington, Delaware Society assured the convention, quote, we feel with you that liberty may become an evil without a previous qualification for its enjoyment and a preparation on the part of the subject of becoming useful to himself, to his family, and his country. End quote. Despite such pressures of fear and accommodation, there were continuing restatements of quote unquote higher law abolitionism. I'm sorry, I said abolitionism. Absolutism. Sometimes my brain just throws weird words in. Quote, no terrestrial legislators, wrote George Bourne, without the most diabolical impiety can legalize this claim upon the human family. End quote. During the Missouri controversy, Rufus King brought the anti-slavery doctrines of George Wallace and Granville Sharp to the United States Senate. Quote, I have yet to learn that one man can make a slave of another. If one man cannot do so, no number of individuals can have any better right to do it. And I hold that all laws or compacts imposing any such a condition upon any human being are absolutely void, because contrary to the law of nature, what is the law of God by which he makes his ways known to man and is paramount to all human control? End quote. King's speech predictably outraged Senator William Smith of South Carolina, who was also infuriated by a militant anti-slavery pamphlet entitled Horrors of Slavery. Yet the author, John Kenrick, posed in 1817 some fundamental questions that had become obscured by wishful thinking. Surely the obstacles to emancipation were not lessened by a prudent delay that brought a substantial increase in the number of slaves. Quote, is it resolved by the nation that Negro slavery shall be perpetual in this land of liberty? Shall those who have their eyes open with respect to the magnitude of the evil hold their peace and do nothing to purge themselves and their country from this dreadful guilt until a righteous God shall repeat in our land the horrors of St. Domingo? End quote. For Kenrick and a few other writers, the imperatives of justice required a flexible approach to constitutional theory. The entire Constitution should not be considered a flawless and unchanging expression of higher law. The temporary acceptance of slavery in the states existing in 1787 could not be allowed to subvert the principles of the Declaration of Independence, of the Declaration of Rights in the state constitutions, or of the preamble to the federal Constitution. According to John Parrish, the Declaration of Independence was a solemn covenant, quote unquote, the obligations of which had been validated, along with other prior debts, by Article 6 of the Constitution. By any fair construction, Parrish argued all slaves had been declared free in 1776, and the Constitution imposed the obligation of carrying out that promise. Other writers stressed Article 4, Section 4, which guaranteed to every state a republican form of government, a form which was said to be incompatible with slavery. The Constitution's overriding purposes, including promoting the general welfare and securing the blessings of liberty, therefore, Kenrick pointed out if the powers of the general government were too restricted to deal with slavery, it was up to the people to enlarge those powers. These views, which anticipated important constitutional arguments of the 1840s and 1850s, were clearly unacceptable to the great majority of early abolitionists. There seemed to be no way prior to the great struggles over slavery in the territories to reconcile the quote-unquote higher law heritage of the Revolution with an acceptance of the established order. There appeared to be no realistic choice between compromise and total inaction. Quote, if we dare not strain legislative authority so as to root up the evil at once, William Pinckney said in 1789, let us do all we dare and lop the exuberance of its branches. I would sooner temporize than do nothing. End quote. Pinckney was then attacking the report of a Maryland legislative committee that endorsed laws prohibiting the voluntary manumission of slaves. Abolitionists reprinted the speech to embarrass Pinckney at the time of the Missouri crisis, when his temporizing had led him to champion the pro-slavery cause in the United States Senate. Even more persevering anti-slavery spokesman, even for more, totally fallen apart. Even for more persevering anti-slavery spokesmen, accommodation had its costs. While proclaiming that human beings could never be legitimately enslaved, abolitionists also pledged themselves to respect the laws of states and the supreme rights of property. They congratulated themselves on gradual emancipation acts, which ensured that slaveholders would suffer little, if any, pecuniary loss, and which guaranteed that freedom would be deprived of equal civil rights. Freedmen would be deprived of equal civil rights. When the abolition societies found that Congress would not, quote, step to the very verge of the power vested in you, end quote, for discouraging the slave trade, they tried without success to implore the legislators to impose the $10 head tax authorized by the Constitution. In 1795, the American Convention congratulated Georgia for passing a self-protective law that prohibited slave imports from any country other than Africa. By 1818, 10 years after the slave trade had been outlawed, the convention was forced to protest the sale of contraband slaves in Georgia for the benefit of the United States Treasury. In spite of such accommodation, or because of it, the moderate abolitionists kept insisting on the need for prudence and pointed happily to the improved condition of Southern slaves. After 1816, the colonization movement gave new hope to this gradualist mentality, since deportation promised to fulfill God's purposes without altering the structure of American politics. The temporizing approach also suited the northeastern mercantile elites, such as the Boston Unitarians, who managed to reconcile both higher law platitudes and a theoretical abhorrence of slavery with a genteel distaste for controversy. It is true that a number of religious radicals veered toward the opposite extreme. The revivals of the early 19th century rekindled the millennial visions of the Great Awakening, illuminating the contrast between the corruptions of a secular society and the ideal of a New Jerusalem. The persistence of slavery, along with other vices, showed that the nation was not under God, quote unquote, that it had not chosen freedom in the Edwardian sense, and that it had respected no principles higher than self-interest. This renewed respect for moral law could easily breed an indifference toward the affairs of a sordid world. A deep aversion to partisan politics would underlie the evangelical quest for a holy community. On the other hand, as early as 1816, the come outer, quote unquote, spirit could result in militant abolitionism. Quote, every voter for a public officer who will not destroy the system is as culpable as if he participated in the evil and is responsible for the protraction of the crime. No human law must be obeyed when it contravenes the divine command, but slavery is the combination of all iniquity, and therefore every man is obligated not to participate in its corruption. End quote. This was, of course, the uncompromising position that Garrison would later popularize. Prior to 1831, it constituted no more than a minor aberration in American thought, overshadowed by the dominant faith in conciliation and gradual moral progress. Between these two poles, there seemed to be no alternative response. Yet even by the 1790s, a few writers began experimenting with other ways of dealing with the Revolution's heritage of inconsistency. In his dissertation on slavery, St. George Tucker correctly described the condition of free Negroes in the North as a form of why did they call him saint? Is he a saint? I don't know. George Tucker, anyway, correctly described the condition of free Negroes in the North, as well as the form of civil slavery. Though Tucker was a liberal Virginian who deplored the moral and social consequences of Negro slavery, he pointed to a line of argument that would increasingly appeal to many Northerners as well as Southerners. If emancipated Negroes were to be no better off than those in the North, manumission itself was of questionable wisdom. It was thus hypocritical for Northerners to interpret their gradual emancipation laws as proof of moral superiority. The fact of oppression could serve as an excuse for continued oppression. And by 1806, as has been seen, a Southern congressman could feel free to be more candid. Quote, I will tell the truth. A large majority of the people in the Southern states do not consider slavery as even an evil. End quote. Such frankness invited Northerners and especially Northern Federalists to express sentiments they had only partially suppressed before. Even during the Revolutionary crisis, Samuel Hopkins, among other New Englanders, charged that slaveholders were petty tyrants who would gladly suppress freedom of speech and inquiry. It had to be admitted, Noah Webster wrote, that the Southern states were still tinged with European aristocratic tendencies. One could only look forward to the day when the large plantations would be broken up and replaced by small farms and industrious free workers. In the 1790s, national political conflict gave a sharper edge to sectional contrasts. Pelham, writing in the Connecticut Current, was unusually blunt. Quote, the existence of slavery may be viewed as one forcible cause of a final separation of the United States. The extreme wickedness of holding our fellow men in chains merely to serve our own interested plans is very generally acknowledged in the northern states, and the sentiment is steadily gaining ground. We are shocked to hear reverential ideas of liberty and equality uttered by mouths worn smooth with curses against their fellow men. How can the hands of men accustomed to do to others as they would that others should do to them clasp in the fraternal embrace those who brood over misery and blood, who smile at murder and ridicule despair. End quote. Aminto, this is a quote, Aminto, that's Amynto, reflecting on the consistency of man, charged that furious Jacobin democracy, end quote, was emerging in the South alongside Negro slavery. Quote, he that is accustomed to rule as a tyrant cannot even bear to be ruled under the mildest system of freedom, end quote. There was thus an inner logic to the South's seeming inconsistency. Quote, consistent mortals opposing as tyrannical not only the free monarchy of Great Britain, but also the much freer Republican government of America, while they themselves reign not only as absolute monarchs, but as the worst of tyrants over the much injured Africans. End quote. Thomas Boylston Adams agreed that, quote, there is a spirit of domination engrafted on the character of the Southern people. Of all the inhabitants of this continent, they are the most imperious in their manners, end quote. I think I've got about 7 or 8 pages left. During the Revolution, Tory and English writers had delighted in casting similar barbs, which would later prove serviceable against the West Indian nabobs. That's Nabobs, and it's in quotes. In the United States, however, such words sizzled with danger. New England had been, in effect, an accomplice in freeing Southern slaveholders from any fear of future parliamentary interference with slavery. New England had also helped protect Georgia and other and South Carolina from any immediate prohibition of the slave trade. The Compact of 1787 showed that the essential for national political solidarity, the family secret could not be mentioned in public except perhaps as an unfortunate heritage from the past. Southern Federalists, after all, would hardly relish Northern Federalist speeches portraying all plantation owners as bloodthirsty tyrants. Presumably for this reason, one Connecticut Federalist wrote privately during a trip in the South that, quote, if I was an enthusiast, I should launch out into the most extravagant denunciation against slavery, end quote. He quickly added, however, that he was, quote, no enthusiast, end quote. When Northern Federalists did allow their enthusiasm to burst occasionally into public, the enthusiasm was not fueled by unadulterated humanitarianism. There was a variety of reasons that explain why some of the shriller Federalist voices should attack the hypocrisy of Virginia Democrats. Quote, a Democrat in the southern states is a planter or other person who owns a large number of slaves who is above labor himself, end quote. Why they should oppose the westward expansion of slavery, should favor the independence of Haiti from France, and should suggest that a dissolution of the Union would be no loss to the northeastern states. On the other hand, some of the anti-Southern outbursts displayed more than partisan interest. Aminto, again, Amynto, in quotes, so a pen name, I guess, for example, exposed one meaning of the slave trade clause in the Constitution. It meant that the American people, despite their idealistic professions, really believed, quote, that the Negroes of Africa, because they are black and we are white, because it is necessary for us to live in genteel refinement at the expense of the misery of the stupid Negroes, because liberty and property are our rights, and this necessarily extinguish theirs, we therefore maintain it to be perfectly right and just to keep them and their children to languish in hopeless bondage. End quote. Few Americans had so clearly perceived the connection between white liberty and black slavery. For Aminto, quote unquote, an anti slavery challenge to the South was a necessary step toward the genuine emancipation of America. In the words of Gustavus, another pen name, I think, quote, it's in quotes, writing in 1797, the question of union or disunion was perhaps, quote, the most important problem which had ever become a subject of public investigation. Um, and then a longer end quote, and then another longer quote. On it may be suspended the decision whether the civilized part of mankind, after improvement of 3,000 years, shall revert to a state of savage barbarity, or whether the present heathen world shall emerge from their native darkness to the knowledge of arts and sciences, of Christianity, and of future glory. End quote. Such words foreshadow William Seward's or Seward's view in 1858 of, quote, an irrepressible conflict between opposing and enduring forces, end quote. There was indeed a striking similarity between the anti-Southern imagery of New England Federalists, as recently analyzed by Linda K. Kerber, and the later, quote, Republican critique of the South, end quote, as delineated by Eric Foner. The Federalists, unlike the Republicans of the 1850s, did not glorify westward expansion or exalt the upward mobility of labor. They did picture the South, however, as a land of tyranny and decay, where power made men brutal, insolent, and irresponsible, where indolence extinguished ambition, where slavery degraded the worth of labor, where self-indulgence drained the springs of progress. Whatever the whatever the actual role of slavery in the nation's economic development, the South symbolized, even by 1800, a set of styles and values directly antithetical to the emerging capitalist ideology. The early recitals of evidence were virtually the same as those of the 1850s. Exhausted and uncultivated soil, bad roads, dilapidated buildings, and unpainted fences. The unpainted fences seem to have been especially grating to New England travelers, nor should modern suburbanites wonder at such a compelling concern over outward appearance, without regard for utility. Southern whites, whether slaveholders or not, had evidently failed to internalize those values that were to provide a basis not only for Northern economic enterprise, but for Northern class and social discipline. A farmer who painted his fences would also presumably pay his debts and feel a sense of common interest with various improvers and developers. A populace that saw dignity in labor would know that, quote, even betas are useful, end quote. Slavery could easily be identified as a source of divergent and threatening systems of values. Above all, it threatened the indispensable myth that American society was founded on a harmony of interests. Pause 1 second here. Okay, yep. There are powerful forces, however, that inhibited the temptation to sectionalize America's inconsistency. James M. Banner, Jr. has suggested a number of reasons for anti-slavery's peripheral character in New England's early sectional consciousness. The chief function of government, according to Federalist ideology, following the Harringtonian tradition, was to protect the security of property. New England Federalists esteemed the Constitution as a product of the highest statesmanship by which the art of compromise had defined the common good. Although they increasingly identified the South as the bastion of their Republican enemies, they viewed the West with even greater alarm, and at times indulged in hopeful fantasies of a Western secession that would bring a renewed sense of unity and common interest to the original 13 states. The threat of the South as a divergent culture ran counter to lingering hopes for an alliance of conservative elites. In addition, the hysteria provoked by the French Revolution intensified the Federalists' mistrust of aliens or of any population, including emancipated blacks who had no stake in local society and traditions. Professor Banner also points to the split between Federalist politicians and the Federalist clergy, the latter being faced with waning power, schism, and denominational competition. As New Englanders felt increasingly isolated from the sources of national growth and power, they could well be expected to turn inward and to avoid any backlash that might result from intermeddling with the domestic institutions of others. The themes of anti slavery literature were part of the wider American ideology that defined the hopes and perils of independence. Although I've necessarily focused attention on the slavery issue, it was by no means the only symbol of a gap between the millennial expectations of the Revolution and the political realities of Union. By the time of the Constitutional Convention, both Federalists and Anti-Federalists were were obsessed with an apparent decline in public virtue. Both feared the emergence of contending political interests other than their own that endangered the supposedly selfless standards of the revolution. Yeah. For New Englanders, who later looked back on the administrations of Washington and Adams as an age of golden virtue, the expansion of slavery was only one of many ominous signs of declension. Some of the more terrifying examples of divine retribution, such as Jefferson's election, the Louisiana Purchase, the embargo, and the War of 1812, were not necessarily identified with slavery. We still have much to learn, however, about the continuities of anti slavery and sectionalism. Why, for example, did New England Federalists show less restraint in attacking slavery in the 1790s when they still had powerful political allies in the South than in the early 19th century when Southern Federalism was all but disappeared? Had all but disappeared. Why were pro English Federalists so little influenced by the 1807 triumph of British abolitionists? Perhaps Professor Banner is right in maintaining that the growing weakness of the Federalist Party, quote, further dampened the Federalist interest in the anti slavery cause, end quote. Yet political strength, as later history testifies, could have the same effect. Federalist leaders showed no caution in demanding a constitutional amendment to repeal the Three-Fifth Clause on slave representation, though such a measure would actually have increased the representation of their political opponents. If Federalists could mistakenly perceive the Three-Fifths Clause as a source of Republican power, why did they hesitate at the next step, taken a generation later, to challenge directly the quote-unquote slave power? This is not the place to pursue such political questions, though they may involve, in addition to the changing style and character of political leadership, a desire to suppress the more radical social implications of the Edwardian tradition, which had already given shape to a militant, uncompromising abolitionism that anticipated the immediatist spirit of the 1830s. In a few brief and tantalizing passages, Professor Banner refers to the sons of Federalist fathers who assumed leading roles in the later abolition crusade and to a, quote, larger Federalist ideology, end quote, which somehow taught a, quote, a third generation of political leaders to understand that slavery lay at the root of New England's powerlessness, end quote. The anti-slavery cause doubtless suffered during a period of exuberant nationalism from the sour taint of Federalist partisanship and conspiracy, yet it is also true that by 1820 the main ingredients of the sectionalist slave power thesis had appeared as an explanation for the nation's moral declension and as a program for militant restoration. The Missouri crisis pointed to a sectional reformulation of the Revolution's great dilemma. Ironically, the revolutionary generation had seen Virginia as the originator of the nation's first anti slavery commitments, the disavowal of the slave trade, and the formal proclamation of man's inherent rights. Yet Virginia's early leadership made it all the easier to sectionalize the national burden of inconsistency. For Virginia, as politics, I'm sorry, for Virginia, as critics discovered at the time of the Missouri debates, had never been in, had never been sincere. She had eagerly welcomed the importation of slaves, so the argument ran until further numbers posed the threat of declining slave prices and possible insurrection. This moment had fortuitously coincided with the rise of revolutionary idealism in the North, and Northern patriots had thus been deceived by the appearance of a united humanitarian will. The Missouri debates revealed Virginia's true colors. Henceforth, the contradiction between revolutionary and secular time, which had seemed to lead to irreversible declension, could be conceived as a contradiction between two cultures or as a contradiction in American space. And that is the end of chapter 7. So, um, let's see how. I am definitely not going into chapter 8 tonight, but I do want to see how long it is. So, oh my god, I may have to break up that. I'm gonna have to break up chapter 8 too. I hate doing that, but my voice just won't hold out for like 60 pages of reading out loud. It just ain't gonna happen. So we will have to break up 8. That's just the way it is. All right. Sorry about the silence at the first few minutes of the video. I will edit that out before I upload it to um, YouTube. But at least thank you, Vesper, again for pointing it out to me because I was totally oblivious to whether or not I had sound. Um, but that will be all for tonight. I am just going to call it. Got an early morning tomorrow because I work a job. So I will see you all tomorrow night. There should be nothing getting in the way of me starting the next Star Wars reading. So I will see you then. Have a good night.